We've spent the past few weeks talking about miracles that Jesus performed, and that Dr. Luke groups them into groups so that that they sort of go together and all. And these groups are separated by other important teachings. And we found out that just because we skip these teachings and these sections, it doesn't mean that nothing important happened there or that those don't have any messages for us today. There are lots of mountains that are climbed and lots of valleys that are crossed in those sections. Now, with that being said, please open up your Bibles to Luke chapter 7. Luke chapter 7. Now again, just because we skip the good part of chapter 5 and chapter 6 doesn't mean that there's nothing there worth any value. But Luke 7 verses 1 through 17 continues with a theme that we sort of introduced last Sunday night in our sermon about worst case scenarios. In fact, this week we might even say that these people come back from the brink. And why is it doing that again? Okay, back from the brink. In our first story, a servant is suffering terribly and is near death. And in the second story we're going to look at, well, a young man's died. And so you see, it can't get much worse than that. We'll approach these stories a little bit differently, though, than we have in the past. Instead of looking at each of the valleys that are crossed and then every mountain that is climbed, we're going to take the stories on a case-by-case basis. So we begin with the centurion's servant. Luke chapter 7, verses 1 through 10. And I don't understand why it's doing that. But anyway. Oh, wait. Now we're really bad. It wants a short sermon, yeah. Kind of like I told y'all this past week, huh? Or this Sunday morning. I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to do this. Well, now it doesn't want to go forward. You know what? You're just going to have to figure it out on your outline. How about that? We won't worry about the PowerPoint, okay? Anyway. Go back there, right there. Stay there. Okay. We'll see how this works. What was I talking? Oh, Luke 7, 1 through 10. When Jesus had finished saying all this in the hearing of the people, he entered Capernaum. There a centurion's servant, whom his master valued highly, was sick and about to die. The centurion heard of Jesus and sent some elders of the Jews to him, asking him to come and heal his servant. Excuse me. When they came to Jesus, they pleaded earnestly with him. This man deserves for you to have you do this, because he loves our nation and has built our synagogue. So Jesus went with him. He was not far from the house when the centurion sent friends to say to him, Lord, don't trouble yourself, for I do not deserve to have you come under my roof. That is why I did not even consider myself worthy to come to you. But say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I myself am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. I tell this one, go, and he goes, and that one, come, and he comes. I say to my servant, do this, and he does it. When Jesus heard this, he was amazed at him. And turning to the crowd following him, he said, I tell you, I have not found such great faith even in Israel. Then the men who had been sent returned to the house and found the servant well. I want us to first talk about the man, about the centurion. Okay, the centurion, because he is what we might call a slight enigma, a little bit mysterious, a little bit, dare we say, curious. The first thing is he's curious in his concern. He's curious in his concern for two specific groups of people. Number one is he's curious in his concern for the Jews. The Jews, you see, were a nation that he had conquered, or that his country had conquered. He was a centurion in the army that had defeated the Jews and was now occupying their nation. But despite that, he had built a synagogue for the Jews in their town there. Now, that's no small task. I mean, think about it. Today, somebody wants to build a building for a university or something like that, it's a great expense. And a lot of times they honor that person by putting their name up on the building. Well, it would be the same thing here, except he didn't want his name on the synagogue or anything like that. It was a place of worship for the Jews that this Roman centurion had built. Now, the fact that he was a quote-unquote enemy of the Jews makes us even more curious. But he's also curious in his concern for a servant or a slave. One that he valued highly. It's possible that this servant or slave was no more than a teenager, but he was still a servant. He was still a slave. He was still, in most households, would have not been that important. And if he was sick or near death, nobody would have cared. But this centurion did care. He's very curious that his master values him so highly. In fact, Dr. Luke, though, tells us that he was sick and about to die. Now, this is the third week in a row I've told you. These are things you don't want to hear a doctor say. I mean, if a doctor, if you're sitting in their office and they say, well, you're sick, okay, that's okay. But if the doctor tells you you're sick and you're about to die, that's something different, isn't it? You don't want to hear the doctor say that. Well, Matthew 8, verses 5 through 13 adds that he was paralyzed and was in great pain. So the centurion is curious in his concern for the nation, for the people that he had conquered, and also for this servant that was sick. And he has a curious in his response, too, to the servant being sick. See, he sent some elders of the Jews to ask Jesus to heal his servant. He's heard about Jesus, and he maybe has seen some of the things Jesus has done. Maybe he's met some of the people that Jesus had healed. And he thinks that Jesus might be the answer to his servant's sickness. Matthew adds, or says, that the centurion himself came to Jesus. Luke says he sent some elders of the Jews. So what do we have here? Another contradiction in the Bible? Not exactly. You see, it's explained like this. The centurion sent these people to talk to Jesus, and they were his ambassadors. They spoke on behalf of the centurion. It was as if the centurion was doing the speaking. It's kind of like the United States today. In foreign countries, we have ambassadors that speak to the leadership of that country on behalf of the United States. And it could be said when that other country is addressing the ambassador that they are actually talking to the president, because it's the president's representative that is there. Well, that's the same situation here. It's not a contradiction. It's just, okay, well, he sent people, and when you send someone to speak on your behalf, well, you're kind of sort of there as well. So perhaps he sent some Jews who knew him, because the centurion knew how a lot of Jews felt about the Romans. See, most Jews didn't much care for the Romans. The Romans had come in and they had conquered the Jews. The Romans had come in and were employing taxes on the Jews. The Romans had come in and they would take stuff from Jews, even if the Jews needed it. It didn't matter. If the Roman wanted it, you had to give it to him. And this was one of the higher-ups, we might say, in the occupying force. Typically speaking, the Jews wanted as little to do with Romans as was possible. So just in case Jesus feels this way, well, we know that one of his disciples was called Simon the Zealot. The Zealots were people who really wanted to fight against Rome. So just in case the centurion sends these Jews that were respected to Jesus, elders of the people. And then notice when they get to Jesus, it doesn't tell us the centurion told them to say this, but they tell Jesus, this man deserves for you to do this because he loves our people and our nation and has built our synagogue. This man deserves for you to heal his servant. He deserves for you to treat him nicely. Well, excuse me. It's also curious about the centurion's servant, not just about the centurion, but about the centurion's faith. It's also curious. Curious because he sends friends to stop Jesus from coming. Okay, first of all, he sends friends to ask Jesus to come to his house to heal his servant. Then when they start getting close to the house, he sends more friends to say, no, you don't have to come. Now, from the elders that he sent, this couldn't wait. From the elders that he sent, this was something, he had to have something done ASAP. I mean, this is a drop everything and go and fix this guy's servant. He's been such a great help to the people. He loves our people. He's built our synagogue. It can't wait. But not only is he curious in sending friends, he's also curious in defining worth. Defining worth, because see, the reason he sends the friends to say, don't come to my house, is that even though the Jews deemed this man worthy of Jesus doing this good thing for him, the centurion himself felt that he was not worthy. Not only was he not worthy of having Jesus heal his servant, he was not worthy of even having Jesus set foot in his house. And he's curious about his defining of authority. Because the centurion understands how authority works. He does. Jesus could command and the sickness would obey, even from a distance. Because the centurion understood. If he gave an order to one of his soldiers who was 10 feet away from him, that soldier had to follow that order. But if he gave an order to that same soldier who was 1,000 miles away from him, wrote him a letter, sent it by messenger, whatever, that soldier still had to obey the order because the order had that authority. And Jesus, this centurion understands that. Yet Jesus doesn't say a word except to compliment the centurion's faith. Although Matthew 8:13 tells us, he said, go, it will be done as you believed it would. But the centurion understands how authority works. I often wonder, do we? Do we understand how authority works? I mean, consider this. Matthew 28:18-20, Jesus says, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to observe everything that I've commanded you, and surely I am with you always, even to the very end of the age. Jesus says, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. If all authority has been given to Jesus, how much authority is left for Carl? None. How much authority is left for anyone? None, because Jesus has all authority. And He has given us a command, a directive. Go into all the world and make disciples of all nations. But instead of taking it at face value, we start to ask questions. What does all the world really mean? Surely He doesn't mean the people that I work with. Surely He doesn't mean my friends, because if I try to bring up the subject and they don't like it very much, they may not be my friends anymore. Surely He doesn't mean all of the gospel, just the good parts, the parts that are fun to talk about. Instead of doing what He tells us to do, we want to look for loopholes. We want to say, okay, the baptism thing, that's kind of tough. I mean, that's kind of silly if you think about it. I mean, getting dunked in water is going to have... the dunking in water is not what's important. What's important is the person's heart. Let me tell you something. If the person's heart is right, they're going to want to do exactly what Jesus said to do. They're going to want to be baptized. They're going to need to be baptized because they know that's the only way that their sins can be forgiven. Certainly this was a valley for the centurion. Not to mention the centurion's servant. I mean, that dear servant lay sick, and there's a Jew who might be able to heal him. But what if? What if Jesus said no? What if Jesus refused to come? What if Jesus said, I'm not going to heal some centurion servant. Forget that. He's a Roman, I'm a Jew. Forget it. We're not going to help him. What if he couldn't or wouldn't help? What if? Truthfully, I don't think that what if ever entered the centurion's mind. He had such great faith that's complemented by Jesus for his faith. In Hebrews 11:1, it says, faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. The centurion was sure that Jesus could heal his servant. He was certain that Jesus would heal his servant. Pride could have also widened this valley for the centurion as well. I mean, think about it. A Roman, and not just a Roman, but a centurion, asking for help from the people that he had helped conquer. I mean, it was obvious that the Romans were superior to the Jews. And yet he's going to ask a favor of healing his servant from an inferior Jew, when he as a Roman had tried everything he knew but couldn't do it? But you know what? Neither pride nor doubt could keep the centurion from asking Jesus for help, because the centurion knew that Jesus was the only one who could help him. So in humility, he sends others to ask, and he places his servant's fate in their hands and in the hands of Jesus. And Jesus holds the centurion up as an example of faith for all people and for all time. You know, the centurion here is one of two people Jesus ever says had great faith. The other is a woman who kept asking and asking and asking for him to heal her daughter. The next story that we want to look at has to do with the widow's son. Luke chapter 7, verses 11 through 17. Let's read. Soon afterward, Jesus went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd went along with him. As he approached the town gate, a dead person was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow, and a large crowd from the town was with her. When the Lord saw her, his heart went out to her, and he said, "Don't cry." Then he went up and touched the coffin, and those carrying it stood still. He said, "Young man, I say to you, get up." The dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him back to his mother. They were all filled with awe and praised God. "A great prophet has appeared among us," they said. "God has come to help his people." This news about Jesus spread throughout Judea and the surrounding countryside. What we have is Jesus and Satan. And they're involved in a collision of sorts, we might say. The collision takes place as Jesus begins to travel south, and he comes to the town of Nain. And while he's there, the disciples are with him. But not only are the disciples with him, but there's a large crowd of people with him. Because he's been doing all these great miracles. He's been healing people. He's been teaching people. And people have liked what they've heard. They've liked what they've seen. And so they're following after him. Given what's been happening, it's probably a very joyful group of travelers. Perhaps they're even singing as they go. Happy songs, joyful songs. They're in a good mood. They're in high spirits because of who they're with. They're with Jesus. But as they travel to the city of Nain, they come across another crowd of people, a funeral procession. The funeral procession, that's Satan. That's Satan's handiwork. Okay, and he's in there, and it's another large crowd, but this one's filled with sorrow. So you have a very joyful crowd of people with lots and lots of people coming down the road, and another crowd of people that's very sorrowful, and they're going to intersect somewhere along this road. Now, when you hear this road, don't think about a 6 or 8 lane superhighway. Okay, this was a fairly narrow path leading out of the city. I mean, it may have been a road, but since most people traveled on by animal or by foot, it wasn't that wide of a road. And yet you got these two huge crowds of people about to meet. But the only son of a widow had died. This lady's been through this valley before. She knows what it's like to lose one that she loves. It wasn't a good feeling then. It's not a good feeling now. Because no mother should have to attend the funeral of her son. That's just not the way that it's supposed to work. But as they meet this funeral procession, there's a collision. Not just between the two crowds, but a collision between God and Satan. And notice the compassion. The compassion that Jesus has as he deals with her, as he speaks to her. The compassion. Jesus sees her and his heart is touched. Okay, he sees her, his heart is touched by her. Perhaps Jesus' mind travels forward in time a few years. And perhaps he thinks about Mary as her oldest son is being carried to a tomb. Perhaps that's why his heart is touched by her grief. And so he goes up to her and he tells her, "Don't cry." Now, sometimes we might say this to someone who is grieving in a feeble attempt to comfort them. But really, when you think about it, crying is a natural human emotion that you're supposed to feel. When you're sorrowful, you need to cry, and it's not that bad, and especially if it's at a funeral or something. Many would say it's insensitive and a poor choice of words trying to comfort somebody by telling them, "Oh, don't cry, it's not that bad, you'll do okay, you'll get through it," so on and so forth. And some would even say this about Jesus. Why would Jesus walk up to this woman who's lost her only son? She's already a widow. She has no one left that we're told about. Why would he walk up to her and say, "Don't cry"? Why wouldn't he just have his followers move off the road and stand to the side and let the procession from the funeral go by? Because Jesus has a plan. Jesus has a plan, and he's going to work that plan to perfection. He's going to turn the tears of sorrow into tears of joy. And so Jesus sees her, and then Jesus raises her son. A couple occasions prior to this that we've looked at, Jesus has healed somebody who was near death. This is the first occasion in Luke's gospel that he actually raises someone from the dead. And of course, the natural result of this is that people are filled with awe. They're amazed by it. Jesus did not know this woman or her son, humanly speaking. But notice, his heart was touched by the grief of this widow. And I think that's a very important message for us today. And that is that Jesus is touched by our grief. If something bothers you, it bothers him. And he wants to make it right. So he comforts her in a way that only his power can. He gives her son back that she had lost. And in the first story, remember about the centurion? Notice that it was the centurion who initiates the contact. It's the centurion who sends the Jewish elders to Jesus to get him to come to his house. He sends the elders to Jesus. Jesus is coming to his house at the centurion's request, though Jesus never actually gets there or meets the centurion or the servant. Sometimes we are, or someone we know is, searching for Jesus. They're looking for Jesus. What are we doing to help make sure that they find Jesus? What are we doing to help Jesus come to them? In the second story, Jesus initiates the contact. Nobody asked Jesus to stop. Nobody asked Jesus to raise the boy from the dead. Probably never even entered their mind. Because to their way of thinking, yes, it's one thing for Jesus to be able to heal people who were sick, but raising somebody who's died? That just didn't seem possible. Well, we might say that Jesus just so happens to be at the right place at the right time. Though I would argue with you about that. I don't think anything that happens to Jesus that we're told about was just a chance happening. I think it was all deliberate. I think it was all a part of God's plan. But you see, sometimes Jesus is searching for us, or He's searching for someone that we know. How are we helping that search along? Or are we throwing up roadblocks to that search? But in each story, Jesus meets the need. Whether it was expressed to him, like the centurions, or it was because his heart was touched by the grief and pain of someone who was suffering. The bottom line is that Jesus can help you out of whatever valley you happen to be in. Whether you have great faith like the centurion, or whether you've lost all hope like the widow in the story. Where are you at? What valley are you crossing right now? Are you crossing a valley that is trying your faith? If so, I urge you, let Jesus help you through that valley, because He can. And He will. Maybe you haven't made Jesus your Lord yet, and you need to do so by being immersed in the watery grave of baptism for the forgiveness of your sins. If that's your situation this evening, there's absolutely no reason why you shouldn't take that step this evening. Or if there's anything else going on in your life, any other valley that you've been trying to cross by yourself and it just hasn't worked, you want the help of your church family. We want to help, and we'll pray with you, we'll pray for you. We'll do whatever it takes to help get you through that valley so you can have another mountaintop experience. But we can't help you if we don't know about it. So if you are here this evening and subject to the invitation of Jesus, won't you come to the front now as we stand and sing together?